Hi there. Today we are taking we're going to take the lower unit off our 200 horsepower Yamaha. We want to get to our water pump. We're going to inspect our water pump impeller. It's the beginning of the season for this boat, so our spring commission includes inspecting the water pump impeller, replacing it if necessary. We grease the drive shaft splines, we grease the propeller shaft splines. We've changed the gear lube already. We do that at the end of the season, so we did that back in the fall. We do that at the end of the season in case there's any water in there. We want to get it out for the winter and replace any seals that might be necessary over the winter before the water does any damage in there, or worse, freezes and splits. Worse, if it freezes and splits your housing, that's damage, and that's bad too. So either way, we've changed the gear lube, so what we're going to do today, we're just going to drop the bottom end off here, and then we'll do another video on inspecting the water pump impeller. But this one's about pulling the lower unit off. So pretty simple. 6 bolts, 3 down this side, 3 down the other side, and there's one up under your trim tab anode here. So to get to that one, we need to pull this rubber plug out of the top. Let's just do a little zoom in there and see that this rubber plug right here. How's that look? Okay, so it just pops out. I put a little bit of grease on them. You see that there? Yeah. I put a little bit of grease on them when I put them in. Helps them get in and out a lot easier. So 12 mil bolt holds your anode in. You get a long extension, a ratchet, and down through the hole underneath that rubber plug. Now, before you loosen your trim tab anode, if it's adjusted at all, to adjust your steering trim, you want to mark it with a Sharpie so that it goes back in the same spot. This one is set up dead center with no trim adjustment on it, but we'll mark it just the same. This one's actually going to go back. We're going to replace this one. I'll show you a close up of that. Let's have a bit of a zoom in here. So we got some pretty good corrosion happening there. Now, we know this boat and this customer quite well. We know he's going to put a lot of hours on the boat this summer. So we're going to replace it before it gets any worse. If this was a real low-use boat, 10 hours, 12 hours a year sort of thing, I'd probably leave that for 1 more year. But this customer is going to do a lot of hours on his boat, so we're going to replace it at this point here. Up under here, now that that bolt's out, we'll have a look. See if we can see up under there. There's a bolt up there. It's a 14 mil head. We're going to take that one out first. It really doesn't matter what degree you take them out in. I take this one out first just to get it out of my way. And then the remaining 6, we loosen them all off first. About 1/4 of a turn each, just enough to crack them free. And then you can start taking them out. Give them all another 1/2 turn sort of thing. That way it's getting undone. It's getting undone evenly. You're not going to get anything pulled out of shape on it. But now that there's no tension on there, you can just undo these. There's no way to get a ratchet in there or anything like that to do it quickly. So I'm just going to stop the camera for a minute. Well, you don't need to watch me do all that. Okay, last bolt left here. I'm taking some weight here so that it doesn't fall out when I get the last bolt out. And it hit the ground. And then a little bit of jiggling and slide it straight down. Now, one thing I forgot to mention earlier was we do this with the motors in neutral. You can do it in gear, out of gear, it doesn't really matter. The shift is on splines, so it'll come out wherever it is. When you're putting it back together, you want to make sure that the control is in the same gear as the lower unit. Leaving it in neutral, it's easy to know. We'll do that when we come out. I'll explain that when I come to putting it all back together here. So we'll just slide this out. There's a bushing up there that supports the drive shaft. It gets a little tight on that. And there we go. We have our lower unit off of the motor and in a stand here. We're going to inspect our water pump impeller. It's under this plastic housing here. They're quite simple. If you haven't done them before, don't be afraid of it. These are pretty easy to deal with. There's a couple of little tips for them, but they're not too bad. I'll show you a couple of things you need to look out for when you're doing this, but otherwise this is a job that pretty much anyone could do with some basic skills and a little bit of mechanical knowledge. Okay, we got our bolts loose there. Pull the housing up. And that's our plastic water pump housing. And then this is our wear sleeve. This is easier to pull off with a screwdriver. And that's the housing that the water pump impeller runs in. It's got a little detent there. Sometimes they have two. This one only has one. And it's also got a cutout on the side there. When you put it back up into your housing, a few things you want to watch for is one, that this O-ring is in place. That seals the top of the housing. And you need to make sure that your little detent lines up with the appropriate hole there, and the cutout lines up with your water pump outlet there. And you'll know you have it in the right spot when it pushes, when it pushes all the way down flush. If it's sticking up at all when you've put it back in, it's not lined up with your tang properly. The impeller here is held on with a, zoom in on that, with a retaining ring here. It's got this outer metal sleeve that's over a plastic sleeve, and that's holding your water pump impeller in place there. And so I made a tool to remove these. It hooks in under that metal sleeve. You can do it if you're careful with a screwdriver, and just lever that metal sleeve up a little bit, trying not to break the plastic one. But I made this to get in under there, and it just lifts that metal sleeve right out of there. I think there's a special tool for it, but I just made one. So then this sleeve here, you can see, well, that's not the split. Where is it? There you go. It's got a little split in it. And it locks into a hollow in the shaft there. Take that off. And then underneath that are 3 washers. 2 flat ones and 1 waved one. One of the flat ones, there we go. Get them out. And we'll zoom in a little bit there. The waved one goes between the two flat ones. That puts tension on the impeller and holds it down. Now this is kind of surprising. This impeller's only a year old. I didn't expect to be replacing it, but he obviously got something in there. A bit of sand, a bit of stick, something like that got sucked up in there and actually cut grooves in the top of the impeller. So this one, it's still, it's only a year old. The bottom of it, if the top of it looked as good as the bottom does, we'd be reusing it again. It's still soft and supple. It's laid over a little bit from the winter, but it's okay. But we've got some cuts in there. I think you can see them. Let's just put a little bit of light on there and see if it helps. Oh, there you go. You can, if I put the light on, you can see that there something got chewed up in there. Okay, I got a new water pump impeller here. We're using a Sierra 18-3071. Sierra is a good aftermarket brand. We use these an awful lot, and in the last 10 years I've had one failure that may have been put down to an owner error, an operator error. Other than that, I've never had a failure with one. So they can only go on one way. Key is in the bottom. There's a slot there. There's no slot in the top, so it'll only slide down this way over your keyway here. Now these bigger Yamahas, the key stays stuck in there real nice and tight. The likelihood of it falling out or not being in there when you're doing this is pretty slim, but sometimes you can put your water pump impeller in there and roll that key right out of there. It'll drop down in the hole. You won't even know it, and the impeller will be spinning on there and you won't be pumping water. So we lubricate it with some synthetic silicone-based grease. This is a brake grease, but it's silicone-based for rubber components. That's what we lubricate our impellers with. A little bit on the plate there. A little bit on here. Now you can get all these parts and the grease from Canada Wide Marine. We have it all on the shelf. Give us a call if you're not sure which one you need, and we'll make sure you get the right parts. A little bit of lubricant on there, line up our key. A little snug right there. There we go. Make sure you're on your key and push it down. Turn the drive shaft, try and turn the drive shaft there, and make sure that your impeller is locked onto your drive shaft. If you can turn that impeller there, your key is falling out. Next piece of the little puzzle is our washer stack. This there's 3 washers. There's 2 flat ones and 1 waffle washer, one kinky one. So that gives us some spring tension there. That pushes the impeller down, make sure it seals on the bottom plate. So the waffle washer goes in between the 2 flat ones. Slide them on. And then your plastic lock ring, which recesses into this hollow on your drive shaft, slides over. Make sure it locks down nice and snug on there. And then the steel lock ring right over the top. 7/8 wrench fits perfectly on there. Ooh. And you can just tap it down with a 7/8 wrench, and that locks your plastic ring on there, compresses your wave washer there, and holds everything down in place. I think we're just going to give that one more little tap. And that's that. There's a slight gap underneath the metal lock ring before the plastic. That's so that you can get the tool in to lift it off later. It does not go all the way down. We've got our housing cover here. Put a little bit of grease into the bottom of that. Probably don't need it because the impeller is nicely lubricated, but makes me feel better. It's all about how I feel. A little bit of grease on the O-ring seal. Make sure that's all in place. Over the top with it. Now the key with this is your crankshaft, your drive shaft turns clockwise looking at the top when the engine's running. This shaft spins the whole time the engine's running and pumps the water. So to put the impeller down, to get the cover down over the impeller, you twist the housing counterclockwise a little while turning the shaft clockwise and pushing down a bit here. So put this on. There we go. Turning the drive shaft and pushing down on it until it locks onto its alignment pins there. We'll just bring that camera back. Now we've got 4 bolts with washers on them. This is a saltwater boat, but even on a freshwater boat, we grease those threads. Grease is there to seal the threads. It stops any salt water, sand, corrosion getting down into those threads, and that way you can get them out again. In the factory, they're sealed with a Teflon sealer, a thread sealer. Grease works just as good. And there's one more bolt there. So I run these down snug, evenly. And I give the drive shaft a turn, make sure my impeller is working properly. Always turn it clockwise, looking down at the top. If you turn it backwards, you'll flip your vanes over. So this turns this way, and all the vanes are like that. If you turn it backwards and you get one of those vanes flipped over like that in there, you'll greatly reduce the amount of water you can pump. So you only turn it clockwise. We snug these right up. This is a plastic housing, so they don't want to be super tight. You'll just distort the housing. Now, what are we getting out of these housings? 5 to 7 years, 5 years I replace these housings. Sort of depends on how many hours are on it as well. But I have found that they stretch a little over time, and then it doesn't seal very well on the impeller. So if your motor's 5, 6, 7 years old, and you're having, well, even if you're not having overheating problems, you want to replace that housing, and it'll help it'll hold the seal on your water pump impeller better. It has to seal top and bottom. When we tighten it down like that, that stainless steel cup has to seal on the top and bottom of it. When this housing starts to stretch a little bit and get old, remember you got hot exhaust coming through right here, so it gets pretty hot down there. It'll stretch over time, and then you lose the seal here, and the water that's caught between these fins can't get pumped through. It bypasses, and you lose your pumping efficiency. So I think the spec might be 300 or 500 hours. I'd have to check the manual. Most of our customers don't do that sort of hours. But just over time, we've seen the housings stretch a little bit. So we just replace them when they're starting to get a little bit older. Now, while we've got the lower unit out, a couple of things to note. This is our shift linkage here, the shift shaft there. It's got some splines on it, so we'll put a little bit of grease on there. Just like that. The other thing we grease is the bolt that's in the back here for the trim tab anode. We took that out before we dropped the lower unit off. Put a little bit of grease on those threads. You'll appreciate that next year. And we also have some alignment dowels, some dowel pins. Now you don't want any grease on the top of it. Let's just zoom right in on that. There we go. You don't want grease on top of it like that. That'll just hold that'll just fill up the hole that the dowel goes into, and you won't be able to get your drive up. You'll end up splitting your housing. So just a little bit of grease around the outside of it, the outside edge. And the other thing we want to check is on the very front here is the passage for your pitot tube for your speedometer. There is a little tiny hole right on the front. Take this camera off and we'll go right up the front here and see if we can see it. It is right there, very hard to see, very small, less than 1/16 of an inch. Very often gets blocked up. So water comes in that hole. Sorry to shake the camera around like that. The water comes in that hole, travels up, water pressure travels up, and operates your speedometer. Okay, so what we do every time the lower unit comes off, take the air line, excuse me, and we just blow it through there and make sure that that passageway is clear. In our water here on the west coast, people are always hitting little sticks and bits of wood, and it doesn't take much to block that hole up. And the last piece of this puzzle before the lower unit goes on is to, we'll just zoom up here a little bit, just pan up. Drive shaft splines at the very top here, they need to be greased. We use Quicksilver spline grease, Quicksilver Extreme spline grease for them. I don't have a full cartridge to show you the name of it, but it's also available at Canada Wide Marine. We keep it all in stock. Now I like to clean the old grease out of there. Just makes me feel better. Now, just like your dowels, when you grease this up, you don't want grease on top. You don't want that. That will get up into the bottom of your crankshaft, and you won't be able to push the drive all the way up. And when you start to pull it up on the bolts, what you'll do is you'll push your crankshaft up and wear out the thrust bearings on in your crankcase, on your crankshaft, and do all sorts of horrible damage. So we just grease this, just the splines, make sure the top is clean. Not a cameraman. Now, we'll go down under the motor here. Let me grab my camera. There we go. Okay, now I can see what we're looking at there. Okay. So, at the very front here, this bit here, this is where your pitot tube lines up, and the water pressure from the front of the drive comes up through this and feeds your speedometer. So this one has to line up with the pickup on the front of the housing. This bit here, which you can see is actually kind of loose and moves around, this is your shift shaft, and it has to line up with the splines on the shift shaft in your lower unit. We move a little further along here, a little bit in the dark, but right up down in there, that's where that's the hole your drive shaft goes through. It's pretty much self-explanatory. And then this one here, this is your water pickup tube. This has to line up with the outlet of your water pump housing. And then further back here, this is our exhaust outlet. This is where the exhaust comes out. So of particular importance, though, is the pitot tube pickup, your shift shaft, and your water pump tube. All three of those, as well as your drive shaft, all have to line up and be engaged properly when you're putting your lower unit on. It's not too bad, but if the shift shaft here is the worst. I have seen cases where the shaft has gone along the side of it, and then you don't have any gears. And I've also seen other cases where people have tried to pull the housing up with the bolts rather than push it up by hand, and they've pushed this shaft straight up through the bottom of the crankcase on the engine, the crankcase, and caused huge amount of damage, and it's a very expensive repair when you do that. So you need to make sure all of that stuff gets lined up. I generally stick my head down under here before I put the lower unit on and just give it a little inspection, make sure everything's good, make sure our water pickup tube is mounted securely. There's a bushing up in here that the drive shaft runs in. We make sure that that's all in there and comfortable, not sliding out, not worn out. There's another alignment dowel here. That's just wiping the grease off of the end of it, put a little bit of grease around the outside. So this one's ready to get the lower unit slipped up in there. Put this back in my stand. How's that look? Okay, I'll grab the lower unit. Oh, and one more thing. Grease your bolts. I do this before I grab the lower unit because it's heavy. Grease the threads on your bolts to seal the threads up from salt water penetration. That way you can get them out next year. Freshwater boats the same. This is a saltwater boat, but even on the freshwater boats, you need to grease those threads. You'll get corrosion up in there because you've got dissimilar metals, aluminum housing, stainless steel bolt. You'll get corrosion in there, and trust me, grease them. Before we slide it up, make sure your control is in the same gear as the lower unit. In this case, neutral, because that's where I took it apart. I find that one's easier rather than having it in some sort of gear. To make sure you're in neutral, you just have to spin the propeller shaft. These things are heavy. So the propeller shaft spins free, and the control is in neutral. So let's slide that up into through the bushing that the drive shaft runs in. You need to keep your shaft lined up pretty square. You don't want to hang the weight of your lower unit on your drive shaft. It's very heavy and it will bend your drive shaft. Just work it up in there nice and gentle. So we've got splines up the top that need to be lined up. Now we've got our three tubes that need to also be lined up. I'm just eyeballing here, just having a look, and I can see that I need to move my shift housing a little bit. I'm just rotating it back and forth to engage the splines in the drive shaft. There they are. And then I just lift this shift shaft a little bit, and I can see that that's in place. And very gently slide it up. And if you can't push it all the way up like that by hand, you've got a problem. Don't try and pull it up with the bolts. You need to be able to push it all the way up like by hand. We'll put our 6 bolts in, 3 on either side, and don't forget the one under the anode. I'll put them in. I'll turn the camera off while I do that. You don't need to watch me spin all of them in. And then I'll be back. Got my bolts all in. I'll just snug them all up. Don't forget you've got one under your anode here, that's got to be done. And 3 down either side. Tighten them all up. And then we've got a new trim tab anode. Turn fin anode, some people call it. This one's got a fair bit of corrosion there and it rotted away. It's doing its job. So we're going to put a new one on for this customer. He's going to put a lot of hours on this year. So I greased the bolt in there before I put the drive up there, so the bolt's still sitting in there through the top. It's hard for you to see there. I've got to work left-handed now. Extension through the hole in the top. Line it up onto my anode. Line up my mark underneath for my trim. In this case, it's set dead center, so pretty straightforward. I apologize if my sound isn't very good. I'm doing the best I can here. We're going to get one of those little lapel mics for it. In the near future, you'll be able to hear me a little better. Trim tab anode's on. Don't forget to put your plug in. I put a little wipe of grease in there. Just helps it pop in and out a whole lot easier. Don't have to fight with it. Propeller has to go on. We've got the thrust washer on there. They stick on there on the taper there. Thrust washer has a taper in there. Propeller pushes on that part, which then pushes on that taper on your prop shaft. Grease your propeller shaft splines. Should do this every year. If you want to take your propeller off in the future, when you ding it or something, always put a little bit on the threads. Slide the propeller on. This one's got a washer on there as well. Put that on. Nut. It's all pretty self-explanatory. One thing some people aren't too sure about is how tight. It doesn't have to be tight. That's plenty snug enough. And then I just line up my cotter pin hole. In fact, that's too tight because I can't get it around cotter pin hole, so I'll back it off ever so slightly. So, you don't want it so loose that it slides back and forth. I don't know if you can hear it knocking there. That's too loose. It's still a little bit loose. This one's going to be tight. There we go. And that's actually lined up perfectly. They don't have to be super tight. The splines take the drive, and the thrust is taken on the washers. And then where's my new cotter pin? And your cotter pin keeps the nut from coming off, so it's not torque that holds it on there. You don't have to make it super tight. And that's that. Cut the excess off of that cotter pin. And you're done. Water pump impeller's been changed, drive shaft's been greased, propeller shaft's been greased. We changed the gear lube in the fall, so I know it's good. We've got a new anode on there. This lower unit's all ready to go for the season. Shouldn't have to look at it again. Not quite ready for the season. We need to test run it and make sure that our gear linkage is connected properly and that we're pumping water. So we're not going to run it right now because I've got some other commissioning work to do, fuel filters and things like that. I'll run it up later. But we'll put the earmuffs on it, we'll run it up and make sure that it's pumping water out of its pee hole. But in the meantime, to make sure that my gear shift is connected properly, it's in neutral right now. I know the control is in neutral up forward. The way we check this is I'll go up and I'll put the control into forward gear, and I won't be able to turn the propeller. I've put the control up forward into forward gear, and now I can't turn the propeller. It's put the lower unit into gear, and now I know that my shift connection is working properly. Next I'll go up and put it in reverse, do the same thing, and then I'll put it back into neutral and make sure it spins free. Back into neutral up forward, and propeller spins free again. So now I know my shift is all hooked up properly and lined up properly on the splines, and we don't need to worry about it. I'll test that again when I run it on the hose. We'll put the earmuffs on and run it in a couple of days when I'm finished the rest of the service and the bottom paint it's about to get. I'll run it through the gears and make sure they're all happy. But this will be good.